Born to Baltic World, I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
It's our week in review. Baltic World is the premier channel. We discuss important issues facing Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. But before we begin, how are you, Crispin?
I am excellent.
Yep.
We have been planning for adventures in Europe.
Yes.
There is a lot going on in Australia in relation to the disease, as you probably have heard internationally. Our country is, global number one hotspot right now.
Number one.
Yeah, and also it's our first wave as well, so we don't really have the same degree of community immunity and things like that, where we don't have the same experience with it.
Yeah, and the systems in place, I think other places have lived with COVID for a very long time have been able to prepare for it, right? As you live with the disease, you kind of know. Whereas in Australia, because this is our first wave, we're still learning of how to cope.
And so there's a lot of new restrictions. Things change day to day, including travel restrictions. So hopefully things don't get in the way. But at present, as we are speaking right now, things are looking promising for adventures. And noting that for Charlie and myself and the vast majority of Australians, this would be the first trip overseas since before the disease began. So I'd be curious as to see how Europe has changed since I was last there. And of course, for all of the audience who watch us, it would be great to catch up with some of you as well.
Yeah.
So really looking forward to it. We've been nailing out the itinerary. And you know how you do, you get excited when you start plotting things out and where you'll go, what you might do. So obviously a lot of it will be to get footage for the channel. We've got a drone. We'll be doing a lot of work to make sure that we've got a nice endless amount of B-roll. We'll be bringing a lot of micro SD cards and things over just to fill it up. So a lot of our days are going to be spent just on day trips to places to get that necessary footage, but also to get a much deeper feel for the place. And it's a different sort of trip. It's interesting when you plan a trip for yourself and you're like, I'm going to go and see all these cool things and I'm going to go to these shows. But when you're planning a trip for the channel, when you think of okay, what's the sort of things that we would do to showcase the Baltic countries to the rest of the world, both from a historical perspective, a travel perspective, a cultural perspective, you really do access different parts of your planning and thinking when you do that. So really interesting way to plan a trip. Not only is it the first trip we've been on in forever, but also the means and ends for which we're doing this trip is quite unique. So it's been a really great experience so far. What do you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like you said, because the rules change so often, it's sort of put my travel hat, take it off, put my travel hat, get the bag. Nope, okay. So I'm very excited to plan this trip. And like you said, we really think, okay, if we want to make the most, right? Because we're going halfway around the world, how do we do it? And really be able to get all the B-roll possible. I'm excited. There's lots of castles I want to visit. Even if any recommendations of any places, please leave them down below and we'll consider it in our itinerary because we're still planning. But yes, let's go, April. Let's not drink it. Okay. But this week, it's my birthday. Well, whenever this comes out, this week is my birthday. And it's been fun. Yeah, we went out to drinks and some food with some friends. And I can officially say I can have my quarter life crisis.
So Charlene is 25.
Yes, I'm 25. Turned 25. Yeah, I always wonder, at what age do people stop telling other people what age they're turning? How people oh, it's my birthday, let's celebrate. But, at what stage do you stop bringing out the cake and the candles and just woo! But I don't know. I don't have that problem right now. So. But it's been so hard. But also so warm. I want to go for a picnic. But ended up having a picnic in a car with the aircon on because it was 42 degrees. On my birthday.
So people in Europe don't experience the temperatures like we experience in Australia.
It's vicious.
I wouldn't go so far as to say the Baltic summer is colder than our winter, but it's definitely the same as our autumn or spring. Like it's way cooler in Europe, particularly Northern Europe. Very few parts of the country fall below freezing. There's Canberra, our capital city, but it's a small city. And because there is sort of in a mountain range in the eastern part of the country, and also parts of Tasmania, because it's so far south near the Antarctic, those places can fall before freezing. You can see snow. But the vast majority of Australia, that is not the case. It's much more arid and desert climate, particularly in the summer. You look outside, the plants are just wilting in the heat. Great for barbecues, great for swimming pools and things. Australia Day would be very outdoorsy kind of environment, despite the disease. And yeah, so it's good for that sort of thing. You can see where Australia gets its culture, basically. It's an outdoorsy culture around water, around barbecue and fresh breeze and anything that cools you down, because it's a struggle against the heat. Much like, in Northern Europe, the architecture is really well built to guard against the cold weather with the double windows, or like the buildings with the very sharp roofs so the snow can kind of slide off it. None of that's in Australia, obviously.
Everything's quite flat, and like, how do you keep the buildings cool as cool as possible? And almost every household has like the solar panels because it's actually very efficient. Okay.
So if the borders open up and you can travel here again, which is in most parts of the country, but I mean without the restrictions and quarantine, well, the time to travel to Australia is in the autumn and the spring. So sort of late March through mid to late May, kind of early June, and then again September, October, November. That period of time, perfect weather, wonderful time to go outdoors, beautiful open skies, everything is lush, everything's great. And then winter can be very wet in many parts of the country. And despite it not being freezing, it's like very windy and cold. And then summer is just oppressive. So
it goes like 47. Some cities are 50 degrees Celsius.
And for the love of all that is good and holy, if you do come to Australia, be mindful of the sun. Sunscreen, hats, cover your clothes. Like, what happens is you go to the beach and you can pick out the tourists straight away
because they're lobsters.
Yes, they look like tomatoes that have just been plucked, and they're in for a bad time, right? So because they just have no idea, no concept of what the sun can do to you in Australia. So we have the highest rates of skin cancer in the world for a reason, and just protect yourself. You'll still get the tan and everything. Like if you cover yourself in sunscreen and whatever, you'll still get the sun. Don't worry. You won't literally die.
UV is very high here, but I do wonder, is it just because we just get a lot of sun compared to other places in the world? Yeah, guess so.
Yeah, there's just not that many. There's not even that much cloud cover.
Yeah,
it's direct sun on the body, scorching heat, and because people, to combat the sun or combat the heat, they'll spend a lot of time in the water, so they'll feel cool and they won't notice.
Yeah,
so like if you go out in the sun and you're just walking down the street, you can feel it on you, and you just naturally go to shade. Whereas if you're in the water, which is what a lot of people do when they come to Australia, go to the beaches and things, completely sensible thing to do, they forget that they're actually getting roasted because you don't feel it. You're the proverbial frog in the pan, gradually boiling away.
Yeah. Okay. So this week, the last couple of episodes have been interesting. You had a conversation about The Witcher.
Yes.
So you, what was her name again?
Lauren S. Hissrich.
Lauren S. Hissrich. So this was a conversation over Twitter on season 2 of The Witcher. Lauren, or I remember in the video you say Lauren was pretty brave in order to, I guess, defend her, argument of why season 2, or I guess the accusation towards season 2.
So for those that aren't familiar, Lauren S. Hissrich is a self-described insider Hollywood, BLM, liberal pronouns, etc., like very, very left-leaning insider Hollywood type. And she's obviously injected that into the show irrespective of the source material. Now, I don't have a problem with filmmakers putting their own spin on things or bringing their own values to something. That's part of the creative experience. You just need to do things in a way that makes sense and entertain.
Yeah.
And I think one of the criticisms is that she undermined the quality of the story through the injection of her personal views. Now, people can agree or disagree with that. Obviously, I've laid out my case in the video, but she was brave enough to show up to discuss the issue with people that were deeply critical of her creative choices, including myself. She has since been hounded off Twitter completely. Not from the critics, not from people like me, but from people on her own side.
Sure.
Who are saying that people who were criticizing the show and its creative choices were creating like an unsafe environment online, like really weaponizing their sort of sense of grievance and victimhood, and criticizing Lauren Hissrich for engaging with or platforming critics, even though some of the critics, such as Jeremy from The Quartering, have a much bigger platform than even Lauren does.
Yeah. Okay.
So she has basically apologized profusely for any offense caused, promised to be re-educated and be a better ally in the future, and hasn't posted anything in a week.
Yeah, and it really like astounds me, because I would have thought, as a good ally, you want to defend your case as much as possible, even to those who oppose it, right? And be brave about it, which is exactly what she did. Like, I would have thought that would be a good ally. Not the whole platforming thing, but actually being public about it, that this is what I stand for, this is why I did it, and and it was great. Like, yes, she has her own worldview, and like that's appropriate. I think what a lot of movies, like, book adaptations, do that.
They do. I mean, look, her creative choices are definitely not to my taste, like I've obviously explained, and I think that they harm the source material and the story and make it more difficult for audiences. But she is faithful to herself, and she was hired to do the job. She was hired, not me, and thus she brings her own spin into it. Yeah. But then when we talk about allies, the whole idea of being an ally is a bit peculiar. Most people just have friends. Most people can discuss things with people they disagree on various topics without it being a threat to them, right? And if you find that people who disagree with you are a personal threat to your identity, then your identity is clearly fragile. Lauren is never going to agree with me on these issues, I don't think, right? I would love to see her change her perspective, but we're probably just different people, right?
Yeah.
And she has the confidence enough in herself to have this dialogue, knowing that if she does change, or if I change, it'll be for the better, right? It'll be because we've been exposed to things that have changed our perspective and forced us to question our assumptions and beliefs. But if your identity is caught up in an opinion that you have about something, if that's who you see yourself to be, and that a challenge to that is a challenge to who you are as an individual, then first of all, your ideas are probably fragile because they can't stand up to any scrutiny. And secondly, you yourself have to evaluate what you value in life, because you should actually be grateful for when your opinions change. Yeah. It means that you've learned something. It means that you've been introduced to something that's expanded your perspective, which adds to your own worldview. And what I would argue with Lauren is that she is in an insular worldview. She believes that because she is in this extremely powerful bubble, that there is a certain enlightenment there, but it is actually a bubble, and that the vast majority of people out in the world don't live the way she does and don't experience the world the way she does.
It's really interesting what you say about how people's ideas become their identity. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Okay, so if something is not objectively observable in the real world, then it's an idea or a belief or an ideology. Okay, you identify as a liberal, or as a conservative, or as someone who's believes in like absolute free speech or something like that. Like if you have an idea and you are unable to describe that idea to somebody else, and you're unable for it to be challenged by somebody else in a constructive way, then that idea is either false in and of itself or dangerous to you as a person to have. Okay. I don't know if that's explained it very well, but basically, if I say I believe in free speech, well, a question you could reasonably ask is, what is free speech? And then I give an explanation as to what I see that is.
And then to what extent can free speech, what's the limits to free speech?
Absolutely.
Or something like, how far does your idea go? And in what situation and context would it, would you say actually free speech is not appropriate here or something like that? Or just
absolutely.
go all angles, right?
Yep.
So okay, well I get that, and like I guess going back to The Witcher, like so. I guess the ideas of putting different characters in different roles, or reworking the character to, I guess, improve diversity and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so we could tie it to The Witcher, right?
Yeah,
so to bring it home. So for those that haven't watched the video, Lauren says that she is a woman and she's a fantasy enthusiast and did not see herself represented in fantasy. And she says, look, I can't speak for any other woman or any other person, but that was her experience and she wanted to see more of that. And then she thought about other people who might not see themselves represented, i.e. people that are not white males, in her opinion. Okay. So she has taken all these characters and made them diversified. Right?
Yeah.
Now, the questions that you would ask are, why is diversity and representation based on race important in a fantasy genre? Why is it beneficial to take existing characters that have been written a certain way with a particular worldview and relations to each other in the story and just randomly replacing them with other ethnicities? Is that a benefit to the story?
Yeah.
Right.
Within the context that it's a Polish author and it was based in a certain period of time. Right.
Absolutely. Well, it's also, I mean, the diversity, and I'll finish the point in a second, but the diversity has to make sense. Okay. So the example I give in the video is that in Game of Thrones, you have an incredibly diverse cast. Okay. All walks of life. Fantasy series, people from different cultures and races, ways of speaking, dress, and obviously skin color. But that all added to the story because you knew who was from Dawn or Essos or Beyond the Wall, the Wildlings, or from Dothrak. Like all of the different places were represented by their culture, and it helped orient the viewer through the story. They could see the different characters and where they come from and their perspectives and worldview and how that tied into the overarching plot.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just take random characters, swap them out for and just roll the dice as to what, skin color they'll have, whether they're Asian, black, or whatever, and just dump them back in their role. Well, if you're a viewer, you're going to get very confused about where people are and where they're from and what they care about and what their history is. And like, it's very hard to connect to the world because you don't know
the rules of the world, right?
Exactly.
And that makes sense, actually. If you think about it, like, fantasy based in, say, China, it would be really weird to have white men in a Chinese, like, movie, in a fantasy Chinese movie, because you think about, like, Han civilization would be in the back of your mind and it would just feel odd. So I guess I kind of get what you mean. Like, it just needs to make sense, right? It can have diversity, but as long as it plays with the rules of that diversity.
Yeah, and I give the example of the show Arcane, which has all the different colors and creeds and orientations and so forth, but every single character's relation to every other character makes sense in the context of the story. And they spend the time to set that up, even within a limited number of episodes. Whereas, so there's nothing wrong with having like your gay characters or your black characters or whatever. That's all fine. You just have to explain to the viewer or the reader why they have that view or why they have that orientation and how it helps shape their perspective. But if you just took an existing character and made them gay or made them black and left everything else the same, it might be very jarring for people whose experience of that character is completely different. And if they have no experience of the character, if they're not familiar with the source material, what brings them to that place? And I think that in a sense, I just think it's lazy to do it that way. And it's done for purely ideological reasons. Lauren justified it on the basis that it helps bring it to a broader audience. But my argument is that things get brought to a massive audience if they're well written, the characters are excellently drawn and acted.
Yeah, irrespective of what they look like.
Yeah, well, in fact, it should be congruent to the story. And the example you just gave is perfect. Like, there are plenty of Korean shows, Japanese shows, Indian shows that just have the ethnicity of their time and place, which makes sense to people who are watching it.
Yeah.
And I said one of my favorite shows is Kingdom. It's set in the 16th century Korea, just after their war with Japan, the Imjin War. I mean, of course, there's no white characters, you know. Like, it makes, and in fact, when they try and shoehorn this stuff in, it gets much worse. A great example is the show Marco Polo. Okay. So Marco Polo, of course, was one of the first Europeans in recorded history to travel to China. Okay, and he went in the 1200s from Venice. And he spends like 20 years or so in the court of Kublai Khan, right? The Mongol leader of China. Anyway, so the first season is pretty good, right? Setting up the relations with the different people, the view of the Song dynasty to Kublai and the war between China and Mongolia and all of that. And then in the second season, they introduce Knights Templar from the Pope into the show, right? So they actually introduce the white people, okay?
Yeah, okay.
And I can tell you, as a white person watching the show, I didn't feel great knowing that I was now represented, right? I felt that what I was watching was insane. You've got, look, 1200s Rome, right?
Yeah.
Way off in the Mediterranean, okay? And the Pope is there, and he's like, man, I'm really worried about the growth of, like, Kublai Khan's power and the threat that it has to the West. From China. Like, Marco Polo being literally the first European even to go that far.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the Pope is like, I'm going to send Knights Templar 10,000 kilometers over there because I need them to fight the Chinese. And I'm like, A, obviously it's ahistorical. It never happened.
Yeah.
B, they were right in the middle of the Crusades at the time. They were fighting for Jerusalem, right? They were like, okay, the Holy Land, Jesus, all of that. That was what the Christians were focusing on.
Yeah.
They weren't thinking about the Mongols of East Asia. They were thinking about the Mongols in Russia and in Vienna and you know, marching toward, you know, threatening Hungary and so forth. Of course they were.
Yeah.
They weren't thinking of Kublai Khan.
But why would they do that?
Because they thought it would have appealed to the wide audience.
Oh my gosh.
And the viewership just tanked because it made no sense. People were like, what are the Christians doing here? Why are these white people with their, like, you know, Knights Templar crosses and things like that, you know, going around on a crusade to convert the people of Mongolia? Like, it was so far beyond the pale in terms of lunacy. And that was probably the one case in which a major show introduced white people for only the purposes of representation. Now, even in that case, it was slightly better than The Witcher because at least the Knights Templar were generally people from Europe, right? So you could be like, okay, they've got Knights Templar. They're from Europe. They're a military order for the Crusades. They were European. So even though they were completely fish out of water in East Asia, having never even remotely gone near that place, at least the Knights Templar were historically sort of accurate as Knights Templar, even though the whole idea was beyond absurd. Whereas in The Witcher, what they would have done is take Knights Templar and made...
And Planck here.
Yeah. You're an elf. You're like a black guy from Namibia. And they would all be washed together and you'd be like, okay, well, why did they join the Knights Templar? How did they ever get to a chapter that would have accepted them? Because, you know, like all these questions come out then. And same is true for The Witcher. They don't, it makes no creative sense.
Yeah. I just recently finished season 2 of The Witcher, and I did find that, man, Yennefer was so boring without her magic. Like, it honestly, like, they really tried to push a storyline with Yennefer, like, trying to find herself in the world, but it just came across as pretty pathetic and kind of annoying. Like, I do agree that, like, I kind of wanted more, like, badass, like, monster hunting. Like, especially with Ciri, right? Like, it would have been cool to have a scene where, you know, instead of just having that spoilers for those who haven't seen the 2, whatever. Ciri goes to the witch's like main rest house, and then they have like this witcher training course. It'd be really cool if the witches were like, oh, we've got this special request to go and hunt these monsters. Who's in? And then she overhears that, and then sneaks with them, and to see real monsters, right? And like her to find her strength through that rather than this boring course. Yeah, I don't know.
Completely. Like, no, I totally agree. And Yennefer, I really like in the books and even in the show in the first season.
And the video game?
In the video game, although I don't find it coming up as much in the video game. Yennefer's strong desire for a child. And she's got all of this power that she traded. Like, she's no longer a hunchback. She has enormous influence as a sorceress, incredible gifts in terms of influence over other characters, and obviously including Geralt.
Yeah.
And all she wants is a baby.
Yeah.
But she gave that up for all this other power, and she's living with that trade-off. And the thing about season 2 that really got me is that at no point in the season is she like, I want a baby. She's like, I want my magic back, right?
Yeah.
So it was really discombobulating if the whole thing about her getting all this magic and not being able to have a child was her learning what she'd lost by not being able to have a child. So when she loses the magic, the first thing that I would have assumed gone through her head is, can I get pregnant? Maybe that's the trade-off. Like, I've lost my magic. Maybe I'm fertile.
Yeah.
And then she could have gone down that road. And if she had lost both, then she could have had that conniption of, okay, well, if I can only have one.
What do I want more?
Yeah. And I would think, knowing everything about Yennefer that I know, she'd want the baby, right? But she doesn't. It doesn't even like. And I think they've gotten rid of that whole idea. Is that motherhood being something that a woman should desire? No, she should have power. Yeah. I think it was a really bad message to send.
But then towards the end, they kind of suggested that she become like a mother figure to Ciri. Like, they kind of suggested it towards the end. But yeah, you're right. It kind of got like drifted off. Oh, we're not focusing on this. We're just focusing on the power because that's the cooler part.
And I think the message is it's very anti the source material and very harmful to women generally, and pushes an ideological agenda that says, okay, it's distasteful that Yen's craving having a baby, which I think is not true. Most women do want children. It's very interesting that the message in the story is that if you are a woman and you want to have it all, you want unlimited power, beauty, conquest, everybody in the kingdoms to bend to your will, and you can't have a child, then as a woman, that could be a really powerful and vexing dilemma. Whereas in season 2, they take a very Hollywood view of this, which is, you don't need to worry about that. What you really need to worry about is power. And that ultimately doesn't make most women happy. And I think Yennefer she never abandons her femininity in the books in a way that they're trying to do with the show. And I agree with you that obviously Ciri becomes the surrogate, but it's not like, I think it would have been much better if Yennefer's connection to Ciri was born out of her angst for not having a child of her own,
right?
And that you could, as a viewer, see that transfer of like, maternal instinct onto Siri.
Yeah.
But when she meets Siri, she's craving power.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then when she's working with Siri, because Siri also has power, she's working through Siri to exercise that power. So that scene with the riverbank and so it's not about motherhood, it's about magic. And
that's true. There was a lost opportunity there. Like, had, she realized she lost her power, then she probably would have made sense. She slept with a bunch of men to see what had happened. And then after that, realizing, oh, damn it, I've lost both. And then, okay. And then the witch being like, find this girl, Siri. And I'm like, okay. And she finds Siri and she sees her and she's like, realize how young she is. And then, slowly just be like, okay, this is what I want. But she has a conflicting thing within herself, like that eternal maternal instinct of it. I need to take care of her, but yet I need to use her. And then have that river scene where Siri is literally like, suffering, trying to get this bridge up. And she does have that moment, like, please stop. But it almost could be a more like maternal, oh man, we should rewrite the season 2. Yeah.
So Lauren, just, you can still have your name on it. We'll just do all the work.
Yeah, okay? we can be consultants for it. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, let's switch topics here. So, Ukraine, big announcement. So the US, Biden, has... Okay, well, from my understanding is they've got, they're selling military weapons to the Baltic States.
Oh, yeah. So one of the avenues by which they are arming the Ukrainians is through the Baltic countries.
Right. Why would they do it that way besides, going, here, Ukraine, or they have no, like...
I think there's a few reasons. One is political in the sense that they're making it clear that they are willing to provide these weapons to the Baltic countries in the first instance, noting that these Baltic countries, are next to Russia, they're the eastern periphery of NATO, and so there is a signal to Russia to say, we are invested in protecting the Baltic countries, number one.
Okay.
Number two, I think there's just a legal question, because when you acquire weapons from the United States using US technology and manufacturers, you cannot provide those weapons to any third party without the express permission of the US government. So Australia has access to all kinds of secret American military technologies. They stay in Australia under a security that is agreed between the US and Australia.
Sure.
And the same is true for all parties. Now, the Americans are providing increasingly advanced weapon systems to the Baltic countries and have given express permission for those countries to pass them on to Ukraine, which may be legally more difficult for America to export in the first place, because they have to have special export agreements in place with the countries they're exporting to.
Yeah.
And I think there are slightly different rules around giving permission to another country to provide those weapons. So if you go direct to Ukraine, you might need to go through Congress to get certain treaties approved. Whereas if you go to the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and say, hey, you guys, we're going to give you these weapons and you can sell them to whoever you like, right?
You can protect them and use your own, considering borders and everything like that.
Exactly. That might have a different legal framework.
Okay, sure. And then because they're NATO, I guess.
They're NATO, so they are easier to export the weapons to. And then the permission to on-sell those weapons to Ukraine would have been made at the executive level in the United States, where the Secretary of Defense or whatever signs a document, says, yes, you can do this, as opposed to having to go through Congress.
So, for this to happen, does this mean that the threat to Ukraine is imminent? Like it's...
Regrettably, yes.
Yeah.
I think we're at the stage now where most people are resigned to some kind of military incursion. And the evidence for this is now kind of overwhelming. First of all, the Russians have already started removing their personnel from their embassy in Kiev, meaning that they're concerned about the embassy being stormed. The Americans have rumors that starting next week, they too will be pulling people out of Kiev. Now, that is a much bigger signal. And I should stress that at the time of this recording, that formal order hasn't been received. It's all just hearsay and rumor on the mill. But pulling people out of embassies is usually the last step before war, because obviously you want to protect your own personnel, get them out of the country. But in the Americans' case, it's even more significant because there is no local reprisal going to be against the Americans. The only reason the Americans would pull people out of their embassy is because they're fearful that Russian military will reach all the way to Kiev.
Yeah.
Which is a big thing, right? It means that most of the Ukrainian countryside will have been captured by the Russian Federation. And also there are other signals as well. So as the famous diplomat Talleyrand once said, you can do anything with bayonets except sit on them. And right now there's over 100,000 troops amassed on the border with Ukraine in multiple areas. And they've been sitting there for a while, and they're continuing to accrue. And it's going to be absolutely humiliating for Russia to back down with nothing at this stage. And so it's likely they have to do some kind of military action. Now, Biden has said, and you kind of allude to this in your question, one of his many gaffes, that if it's just a small incursion into Ukraine, maybe it will be a minor reprisal, i.e. almost giving Putin a green light to do something in Ukraine and no one will do much about it. I think that's probably... I hope that is just a gaffe on his part.
I hope so too.
I mean, look, and others did qualify those statements, and often it's people like Blinken and Sullivan who are making the public statements on this issue. And thus, if Russia does invade Ukraine, hopefully there will be a united response. But it is telling how reluctant the Germans have been in all of this. So first of all, the Germans have not given permission, in fact, explicitly prohibited third-party countries from providing weapons to Ukraine. So they're not...
What do you mean, like their weapons?
Yeah, so if you buy like a German-made Beretta or something like that, you can't then supply those weapons to the Ukrainians.
Right. Why are they doing that though?
Well, because they don't want the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves with German weapons, I guess is that's the only explanation. They don't want to upset Russia by allowing this to happen. They want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There's also been a naval admiral, I think chief of the Navy in Germany, who's just resigned because he made sort of pro-Russia comments about Ukraine.
Okay.
So Germany is very reluctant to do anything about it. And there is a view in Germany that NATO has expanded too far, which is frankly a bit rich, given that it was only the existence of NATO that prevented West Germany from being completely annexed by the Soviet Union, and what spared much of Germany and kept it free in the after the Second World War was the might of the NATO countries, willing to even fight a nuclear war on their behalf. And so having avoided the same occupation, except for East Germany, of course, avoiding the same occupation from the Soviet Union that the Baltic countries and Poland and
have
all experienced, that is, quite cowardly, to be frank. And plus, they have, a pitiful defense expenditure relative to their GDP. We're talking about a country that has 3 times the GDP of Russia. Germany is more than capable of defending Europe, but it's being left to Poland. Poland is the one that's doubling its military and its size of its army. And the Americans are providing, weapons, but not much else. The Brits are providing a lot of trainers. That is positive to see. They've got the Brits probably have the most foreign troops on Ukrainian soil as we speak, in terms of I think about 1,000 people, mostly people who are training, doing joint exercises, kind of teaching the Ukrainian defenses in various forms of modernized, mechanized warfare. But they're not there as combat troops. They're there to provide training. So Britain is sort of muscling up.
Maybe we were talking about this, but what's the goalpost? So what's like Russia's success point to all this? To capture all of Ukraine or parts of Ukraine, or will it keep going further and further expand? Is that what they're...
I think they're trying to work that out now.
Oh, okay.
The Russians, I think at a minimum, would be those areas of Ukraine that are majority Russian speaking. So Donetsk, Donbass, eastern parts of Ukraine, for them to be formally annexed into Russia the same way they've annexed Crimea, creating a direct land corridor between Russia and Sevastopol. That would be their minimum, I think, which is a huge part of Ukraine still. I think at a stretch target, they would want to capture everything in Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, including Kiev. And just push like the rest of Ukraine as centered around Lvov in the far west.
Yeah.
That is probably their ultimate goal, but whether they think militarily they can achieve it, whether they think that the response from the international community will be so grave as to make it not worth their while, whether they could hold it if they did capture it. All of these are big questions that I think the Russians are probably debating right now. But at a minimum, success would be those that speak Russian, part of Russia.
Sure. Okay. So, and then also then in America, like, what is the internal views of it? So do all Americans believe that we should be fighting for Ukraine?
Well, that's actually really, so much of this is driven by internal American politics. And the divide on foreign policy in US politics is between those who want a far more restrained foreign policy and those that maintain a global view of American power and position. The divide is not partisan. The divide is between the establishment and the populists. The populists being kind of pro-Trump, Tucker Carlson, those like popular nationalist American right, Steve Bannon types, and they make up a huge portion of American political class now, particularly within the Republican Party.
Yeah.
You've got Matt Gaetz and Ted Cruz and all of these future political presidential possible candidates, Ron DeSantis, Trump himself. And they look at the history of American foreign policy and see a litany of disasters. The Iraq War, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, thousands of American lives just squandered, trillions and trillions of dollars for nothing to show for it. And they blame firmly these, establishment elites who have dragged America into every possible conflict. Then there is a kind of an element of the elite class who are the ascendant realists, who say America's like apex unipolar moment has passed, China is the main game, Taiwan is the principal theater, and we have to, if we can, bring Russia to our side because they're going to be a critical player in the generations-long struggle against China. And so they took a look at this purely from a realpolitik perspective, aligning means with ends, prioritizing their foreign policy objectives, and they tend to align closely with these populists. They say, look, we have to count the cost when we do something. And what's more, I agree entirely with that principle that America has been a disaster over the past 2 decades. No accountability for the failures, continually recycling the same people. For example, Samantha Power, principally responsible for the Libya catastrophe, is now recycled back into the Biden administration. Even Hillary Clinton is looking at running again in 2024. So all of these people are just always there despite their perennial failures. And then you've got people like Elbridge Colby, who I've covered in the podcast before, made videos about his new book. And he sets American strategic priority. The rise of Asia is the peer competitor that is China. China wanting to eclipse the United States and replace it as the number one power in the world with the population, economy, and history to do that. And thus, we have to rely on the Europeans to do more for European security. Yeah. So all of this is true. Then you've got people who say that, look, if we appear weak to Russia, to those that clearly are trying to undermine our alliances, our NATO structures, our rule of law, our values, those that are right in our face doing it, then all we're doing is inviting more aggression. Let's say Russia invades Ukraine and America does nothing to stop it. Does that mean that Russia will suddenly become America's friend and be grateful that America didn't intervene? Or will Russia then go, you know what, those Baltic countries, they should also be part of Russia,
right.
or NATO needs to roll back to, the west of Germany.
So you're like permitting more behavior instead of...
Yeah, I mean, you're just appeasing people that are wanting to expand. And that is a very good point. And I can't disagree with that. I mean, if I was Vladimir Putin and I met no resistance, why would I stop? Like, there is like...
oh, wow.
So...
But then you got to balance out with, like, global priorities, right? Because I remember in the past few weekend reviews who said, like, the prime aim is China. Like, that is the big beast. Like, we can't just focus on these smaller countries, and other countries need to step up in order to fight the other conflicts.
Exactly. The quip among the populace is, why does American political elites and globalists care more about the Ukrainian border than they do our own southern border, right? They're letting in all people across the southern border into the United States, and yet they seem thrilled to go and fight a war against, a nuclear superpower in Russia on the Ukrainian border on the far side of Europe. So I can understand this kind of sense of disconnect where the cost and burden of military intervention is borne by the American taxpayer, not by these elites, nor are these elites accountable for the failures that they've already shown over the course of decades.
Yeah.
Plus, you're right that there is a need to prioritize. The real villains here are Germany and France, okay? These are countries that are more than capable of defending Ukraine, defending the Baltic countries, stepping up and standing up to Russia, and they're failing manifestly to do it. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, connecting Germany to Russia, they're kowtowing before Russia, and they don't need to. They're just doing it because they think it's in their interest. It's an incredibly self-absorbed and frankly short-sighted approach to their foreign policy.
Right.
And if I was the United States, I would be much stronger on these countries. And so all the criticism that Trump got about Russia and all of that, including within the Baltic countries, I don't agree with that, because first of all, Trump was the only president to sell offensive weapons to Ukraine. Obama manifestly refused to do that his entire time, even when Ukraine was annexed with Crimea. Even when Biden was vice president, I'm sure he supported Obama's position. And then Trump also expelled dozens of Russian diplomats after the Novichok nerve agent attack in the UK. So something that didn't even happen on American soil, he retaliated against Russia on behalf of his close British ally.
Yeah.
And
didn't he take US military troops out of Germany too?
Well, he was planning on it. I don't know how far and successful he got. He was shocked to learn that there were 35,000 American troops in Germany. And of course, that was a hang up from the Cold War, back when the Soviet Union was right across the border. But no reason for them to be there now. Germany is capable of defending itself. And so this brings me to my own advice, which would be, put enormous pressure, not just rhetorical pressure and you're naughty, whatever, but enormous pressure on Germany and France, like in every possible forum, humiliate them, cancel contracts, increase taxes and tariffs, whatever you have to do to make it clear to France and Germany that they have an obligation to defend Europe, and get them to spend the appropriate amount of money on their defense, and I mean, the fact that...
It blows my mind, like, if they're not spending on defense, what the hell are they spending on?
Their economy. They're manufacturing cars, export. They're, creating new contracts with China. Ted Cruz, a Republican senator, introduced a bill into Congress that would have put sanctions on Germany for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, they didn't pass, of course, but I think if I was the US president, I'd be pushing that. I'd be like saying, look, you are our ally. You are doing business with our adversary. You are exposing other allies that are allies to both of us, because we're all in NATO, to undue risk, and you're inviting this aggressive expansionist power to invade other partner countries because of your inherent weakness. And we're not going to put up with that. Now, Biden lacks that moral courage, and thus it won't happen, and means that not only is Russia getting away with its behavior, but also France and Germany. That said, hopefully it will change. And also, I agree with the underlying presupposition that we need to improve relations with Russia over time, that we need to tease them away from Beijing's orbit. But I don't think you do that from a position of weakness. What you do is you say, okay, you've amassed troops on the Ukrainian border. We're going to put so much more military equipment into Ukraine. We're going to deploy tens of thousands of more troops right across the border in Estonia, 100 kilometers away from St. Petersburg, to make it abundantly clear that you will pay a heavy price for invading Ukraine. Now, if you pull back from Ukraine, we will pull back and then we'll talk, right? Sure. We're not doing it to say, okay, you've put all these weapons and troops and threatening Ukraine, and we have to then come up with things to appease you to stop you from invading. Now, that's not how it's going to play. It's going to play like this. We will put in all the weapons necessary to threaten Russia, and then when you pull back, we'll pull back, and then we will talk as on an even keel, okay? Yeah. And that way, you actually do send a message that we will answer strength with strength, and we'll answer honesty and diplomacy with honesty and diplomacy. And that's not me hating Russia. I can understand Russia's point of view. I do think that Russia is acting faithfully, that they actually do believe that Ukraine is part of Russia or a greater Russia, and that their historical narrative about, you know, the Kievan Rus and the Orthodox Christianity and the Pan-Slavic identity and the origins of Cyrillic and all of that, that the Russians genuinely see the world in those terms. Yeah. And they're not doing it just out of cynicism or as a power grab, but they actually do believe that they're protecting the Slavic peoples of the world. Yeah. I'm willing to give them the credit of that. I don't see evidence that they don't believe what they're saying. It's not the way that the Ukrainians see it. It's not the way that the rest of Europe sees it. The exercise of force in manifesting that worldview is incredibly harmful. But I'm willing to respect Russia on that basis and to have that dialogue, but not at the barrel of a gun, at the side of a conference table.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it would be different if, say, the parts of Ukraine felt like they would be liberated. If what to say, like, if the attitudes already existed, but it seems like they're almost being imposed. I don't know.
Well, at the moment, Russia is still looking at the low-hanging fruit.
Sure.
Obviously, the big step would be them marching into the Baltic countries, because then they're attacking NATO. And then we would see just how far German cowardice goes. That's a ways off. There is those parts of Ukraine that are strongly nationalist, those that believe that Ukraine is an independent country, has its own culture, its own traditions and so forth, and absolutely deserves to have its territorial integrity, which is the majority of Ukraine, but concentrated in the west of Ukraine. So those in the far east of Ukraine who are native Russian speakers, who see themselves as kind of nationally Russian. Now, it should be said, they don't all want to be part of Russia. They see problems with being part of Russia.
Sure.
But there is a greater concentration of people that see themselves as Russian in that part of the country. It's also right on the Russian border. So moving into that territory would be within Russia's capability, and it doesn't trigger any NATO responses, Article 5 or anything like that. So Russia could get away with that. But Russia's argument that, NATO is what's threatening Russia, okay, it's true. NATO has stretched to the Russian border, and if I was in Russia, I would perceive a threat because NATO was made to challenge the Soviet Union, even though that, of course, NATO is a defensive alliance, has no intention of invading Russia or will ever invade Russia. But I can understand from a Russian perspective apprehending a threat. But then using it as a justification to march into Ukraine, which is not part of NATO, is a hell of a stretch, right? So you can see a kind of cynical move there. They're using the excuse of NATO to do something that the Russians would like to do anyway.
Sure. On that note, Slovenia. So the
Yep.
Prime Minister, Janis Janša,
Mm-hmm.
says Beijing's ridiculous response to Lithuania won't deter his own country. So it seems like Slovenia is taking strides, the same strides as Lithuania, and building relations with Taiwan.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah, so some people in the comments did say, look, it's unclear exactly what name they're going to go with, whether it's Taiwan or Taipei. Now, most countries in Europe, or many countries in Europe, have offices with Taipei, which is the name that China approves of, right? Like Chinese Taipei. I got from the interview that that's not the case, that the Slovenian Prime Minister is supporting Lithuania's position and is looking to adopt the Lithuanian model, but that remains to be seen. It was just this one interview in the Indian press, so they'll need to be clarified. But in the context of that interview, he was deeply critical of China in all kinds of ways, whether it be on the pandemic, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, South China Sea. He went through the whole list and panned China on every point. So it would be an odd thing to say, but we're going to appease China on the Taiwan issue. I think that in the context of what he was saying struck me as being, we'll open it as Taiwan.
It strikes me that all these smaller countries that, don't have a huge dependence on China can speak out like this, speak so openly and be headstrong.
That's right. Yeah, it is. It's a very Eastern European trait, those that have experienced communism firsthand, although Slovenia, of course, is part of Yugoslavia, sort of borderline there. So very much they can relate. They see Taiwan as being similar to them, small, oppressed, threatened, wanting to exist independently, democratic institutions. And so for moral reasons, they are supportive of it. There's also the economic dimension where Taiwan is announcing considerable investment in Lithuania, including on high-end microchips and processors, the things that Germany and France have wanted for a long time, but never gotten. So that's working really well as well. That said, there is a lot of pressure from German companies. Here we go, Germany again. I'm never going to get sick of talking about Germany in this way. German businesses putting pressure on Lithuania to back down on the China question. Well, because China is putting pressure on third-party companies. It's a really underhanded tactic. So not only is China stopping all exports to and from Lithuania, cancelling visas and doing all that stuff, they're going to other companies that have much greater dependency on trade with Lithuania and saying, if you want access to the Chinese market, you will stop doing business with Lithuania. So let's say you're a German car company who sells BMWs to Lithuania.
Yeah.
Well, the Chinese are saying, okay, so long as you sell BMWs to Lithuania, you will not be selling BMWs in China, right?
Wow.
That's the kind of tactic that the Chinese are engaging in. Now, of course, if you're a German company and you lack any kind of spine or moral fortitude, then you go to Lithuania and say, look, you have to back down, otherwise we can't do business.
Yeah.
And what should be done is, of course, the Germans, the French, the entirety of the European Union, which together is much larger than even China's economy, should say, we won't deal business with China so long as you're punishing and attacking a sovereign member of our joint collective environment, the European Union, in this way. And that would be the correct response. And then China would be put in the situation of, like, do we want to tank our economy for the sake of this one fight with Lithuania, or do we back down?
And I guess becomes more of a problem if smaller countries continue on the same path, right? And it would add more pressure. I'll be like, okay, if they're going the same tactic, if they're looking at third-party countries, like if you don't deal with like Slovenia and then another country and then like.
Well, it's becoming a real crisis for the EU.
The EU, yeah.
Because if you've got all the small and Eastern European countries, so let's say the other Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, if they start supporting Slovenia and Lithuania, because every country that moves makes it easier for other countries to also move. If they do that, then you've got a significant portion of the EU membership that have their own upgraded trade relations with Taiwan. And is China going to punish them all? And if they do the bigger EU countries try and put pressure on the collection of smaller countries, or do they take the side of their fellow Europeans and stand up to China? And I don't have confidence that Germany will, because I've seen no evidence that they're doing anything. Yeah, track record. Thus, it creates a tension within the European Union, where you've got like the pro-Taiwan faction and the pro-China faction. The problem that Lithuania has is also domestic. The current government is low in the polls, and the strongest proponent for the current policy, which is the foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, he is resolute on this subject. He's like, we're never backing down. This is who we are. We're doing the right thing no matter what. And of course, he has my enduring respect. Politically, though, if they get voted out by a large margin, if a lot of people say, look, we don't believe in this, and they kick them all out, then it's going to be very tempting for any successor government to flip course, blame everything that happened on the previous government, and go and support China. So if I was Taiwan, I would seek to capitalize on this as quickly as possible, this window of opportunity, by getting many other countries like Slovenia on side, but also, holding out the promise for similar investments elsewhere, or get some of that promised investment off the rank now, so that the future government that comes in
can't back down.
They'll have to pay a price, right? Like if it's all future investment, if you say like over the next 10 years we'll invest $1 billion, just to pick numbers out of the air.
Yeah.
Well, if it hasn't been spent yet, no one in Lithuania will feel its loss should they change path. All they'll experience is all those businesses that had previously been frozen out will be able to do business again. All those visas will be issued. Trade with China will normalize, and things will get better. Yeah. Okay? But if Taiwan front loads that investment as quickly as possible, gets that money out there so that $500 million is spent in the next year, well, in that case, all the people that have been employed, there's new industries, the new factories, and it's made clear that Taiwan will pull that money out if their trade officers downgraded. Well, that creates a serious problem for a future Lithuanian government to change course. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that the Taiwan's position is the right one. I think the Lithuanian position is the right one. And it is a good thing to show the benefits of that relationship as quickly as possible, to encourage countries like Slovenia and other smaller players to do it. Now, I don't think this tactic will work for the bigger countries because they have too much trade with China. Taiwan's economy, as advanced as it is nowhere big enough to challenge China in that way. But it will get some runs on the board and hopefully get people into your corner in a more permanent way.
Yeah, sure.
But it remains to be seen. I hope that Lithuania isn't forced into a back down. I don't think the current foreign minister will ever do that. I think it's part of who he is, that he's going to stand up for freedom and justice no matter what, and hats off to him. But if his political office is taken away, if he's voted out, if his coalition are voted out, then who knows?
It's interesting. One comment from Axel was like, as a Slovenian, I agree with the move to directly stand with Lithuania against China on the issue of Taiwan. But the way the PM did it without mentioning it in the House of Parliament or the nation, first announcing it through an interview in the Indian media, I'm not thrilled on that bit. I don't think that is how a nation's major change to foreign policy should be announced.
I agree. That's it.
It is a bit random, isn't it?
Sure. Like, yes, you shouldn't make big announcements about your domestic the foreign policy that is mostly for domestic purposes in a distant country. That is an unusual thing to do. I think, however, to be fair to the Prime Minister of Slovenia, I think it was because he was asked about it directly. The interviewer had done a lot of research on the Prime Minister, including a story about how he met his wife and like how they lost their wedding ring and how it was found, all of this stuff. It was there were detailed questions, and the Prime Minister actually went out of his way to say, I'm surprised by the depth of research here. Just the Slovenian Prime Ministers, like in some, tiny country, far away from India. India has like 1.3 billion people or something. So
yeah, might have made him feel like a VIP, right? Like
yeah, exactly. I would have thought more like a US president. So when he was asked these questions, I think he just gave honest answers. So it wasn't like he got up on his lectern and says, here I am announcing a new foreign policy. I think he was just being honest when asked a question. So I do take your point. I think that most such things should be announced within one's national parliament and have a debate domestically about these things. But I also sympathise with his situation.
Yeah. And then speaking of trade, you're talking about Lithuanian rum because you're not much of a beer drinker. And Mindaugas, I think.
Yeah, Mindaugas
says, don't be excited about Lithuanian rum. Lol, we have never even heard of it. The guess is that it's very poor quality export product specifically to China.
Look, okay, so maybe that's true. Well, I mean, it's certainly the
6
case.
likes.
Okay, so Mindaugas, it's certainly the case that Lithuania doesn't strike me as the climate for sugarcane, where most rum is made. So if you're thinking of the rum that comes from Mauritius or Havana, these tropical islands, yes, it does seem like an odd product. Nevertheless, we will see. We will go and judge for ourselves whether or not it's any good. And if it is good, you'll definitely hear about it. And if it's not, maybe we'll never speak of it again.
Very much so. So we also have a comment here for Dinas. They've said the analysis about the benefits of semiconductors needs a more critical approach. Lack of talent, infrastructure, know-how. It may take a lot of time to set up such a factory in Lithuania. So he was speaking to the point of the trade between Taiwan and Lithuania on those semiconductors.
Well, I totally agree, Dennis, with that analysis. We have the same problem here in Australia. We've got the announcement about nuclear power submarines going on with America and Britain supplying them. The problem is we don't have the nuclear infrastructure here in Australia. We don't have the nuclear engineers. There are all these things now where people can get paid for their degrees and while they're doing it, if they do nuclear science and so forth, just because they need to get people in as quickly as possible. All the medical, all of the nuclear safety, safeguards. These things are things Australia needs to develop really, really fast in order to support such infrastructure. And Lithuania is the same. Lithuania isn't known, obviously, for semiconductors and will require a lot of support from Taiwanese engineers and developers to do it effectively. That's why I think Taiwan should also be looking at the quick wins, the things that get things off the rank now, so that they can demonstrate support for existing industries, particularly those industries that are currently suffering as a consequence of the embargo from China. One of them being rum export, but I'm sure there are others as well where Taiwan can step in and provide that investment and support to keep these things going. Not just as a consumer, like taking the products that would have otherwise gone to China, they should do that as well, but also direct investment into those areas that would otherwise have experienced growth with China in the longer term.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, I mean, the other comments basically of agreement. Some people are kind of, it's the inevitable that China will invade Taiwan, so what's the point kind of comments. But
well, what do you mean by that?
So let's see. Calvin Blue says, it's the red line. China will definitely invade Taiwan when you push Taiwan's independence. China already put the matter aside. It's obvious that she has no intention to deal with the matter and wants Taiwan to remain status quo. No economic boycotts on Taiwan, plane incursions already lessened after Lithuanian matter subsided. Now you want to push it. You guys continue this path. The world is going to end. Wake up.
Oh, thanks, China. Yeah, like and subscribe. There's like 1.5 billion possible Chinese viewers, although they don't have access to YouTube unless they meet certain criteria. Look, I mean, let's assume that this is a good faith actor who is watching the channel and just disagrees. Okay, we'll assume that. Taiwan's air identification zones have been intruded dozens of times in the past year. The support, like the manifest downgrading of Taiwan support around the world has continued. China has sought to create a new deal with the papacy, so the Vatican, that would remove one of the last vestiges of recognition of Taiwan from the world. The idea that they're not changing the status quo, look at Hong Kong. They made a deal with Britain for 50 years to maintain the institutions that had been transferred when Hong Kong was handed back to Beijing. And Hong Kong is now completely subsumed into China. All the same amount of censorship, the removal of any statue that's offensive to the Communist Party, the national security laws, so anything that is seen as pro-democracy is a crime in Hong Kong. It's now very much absorbed into the mainland. So to say that the Communist Party under Xi wants the status quo with all of these different groups is totally insane. The 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party speech in 2021 was, he said Iron Wall. He said that the unification of Taiwan into the mainland is an indispensable part of national rejuvenation. So President Xi has said that having Taiwan rejoin the mainland under Beijing rule, under communist dictatorship, is a indispensable part of their objective, no later than 2049, probably much earlier than that. The idea of status quo is explicitly not China's position. China wants to change the status quo and is willing to employ any means of coercion, including military force, to see that outcome. And if I was from China's point of view, it seems like an obvious goal. Like, Taiwan is 100 kilometers off the coast of Shanghai, a permanent aircraft carrier to the United States. I see myself as this middle kingdom, the greatest civilization in human history. We had this civil war where the nationalists escaped Taiwan. Yes, they created a democracy and so forth, but that civil war never properly ended, only by the intervention of the Americans in the 7th Fleet. If I was in the Politburo, why wouldn't I expect Taiwan to be reintegrated? Now, the rest of the world, both for military strategic reasons, but also for democracy and human rights, because what Taiwan stands as a complete reproach for the communist model. Taiwan has proven that you can be a Confucian Chinese culture and have democracy. That's the real threat to the Communist Party, because it attacks their legitimacy. And so if you're a communist dictator...
Hong Kong kind of had that too.
Yeah, absolutely it did. And
on the mainland.
Yeah, all the criticism that the Brits get for their colonial past, they left a lot of good institutions around that people tended to like, including the people of Hong Kong, and they didn't want to lose them. And the people of Taiwan have created their own democracy with political parties and elections and free press and independent judiciary.
Yeah.
And China wants to crush that because they can't stand the idea that not only is there a threat to communism internally and people disaffected from the rule, and so the government puts in new facial recognition and social credit system and online Great Firewall of China and all that to control any discourse, information, and dispute about Communist Party. But you've got this other entity for controlling over 20 million people, democracy, showing that you can be a successful Chinese economy without authoritarian dictatorship, which is completely antithetical to what the Chinese claim. And so, it's of course, President Xi or any successor that purports to be a communist is not going to allow the status quo in perpetuity. They will seek to reform the status quo, as they have with Hong Kong.
Sure. Okay, cool. I think that's all the comments. Oh, clicked off it. No. Okay. Yeah, that's all the main comments. There's other comments, but was there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think we've really done a great week in review. I mean, Charlene and I have gotten a bit distracted from normal programming because of the upcoming trip, which is now 2 months away, and it's so like I got really excited about it maybe a month ago because I was like, yes, let's do it. But then news comes out domestically about restrictions and infections and government kind of saying new things, going back on old things. So this trip is like, it's become this precious little thing that I'm a bit feeling fragile about. So I've been focusing on it, but hopefully it'll firm up in the next few weeks, and we'll be able to talk itineraries. But as Charlene said at the beginning, definitely leave your suggestions down below. If you're from particularly the Baltic countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we've got our itineraries, of course, the capitals and some major sites and things. But if there are things that are a bit off the beaten track, things that you think would be good to film in particular, that require local kind of knowledge, definitely leave your suggestions down below because we will go check those out. I will also try and meet up with some other content creators that focus on that area. There are some channels that we follow that discuss these issues and get their advice as well. So that, yeah, I'm looking forward to it, but it has distracted me from the recordings. Hopefully by the time this comes out, there'll be a couple more videos on the Ukraine situation. Yeah. That's something else someone else has said before I finish up. They're like, look, you could focus on other things. And yes, we did one on The Witcher, of course, but there's many other things going on in Latvia and Estonia and Poland that I do want to discuss. But obviously the Ukraine situation is the fastest moving right now with a lot of implications. And because I can only churn out a few videos a week plus the week in review with the current resources we have, obviously I focus on the fast moving crisis, but there are underlying stories that I would very much like to cover, things that have a much more of a slow burn, but perhaps over years are even more structurally important. And hopefully we'll get back to that programming soon. And also, but don't be shy. If you have a topic that you want me to cover, particularly if you're on the Patreon, but also just in the comment section, send it through because I like these suggestions. Multiple people will want to hear whatever the suggestion is. So let us know.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the great benefit of being on YouTube and having the comment section is that you guys can help build this channel with us, and provide your suggestions. Yeah, I was about to say, with the tight resources, like, can we submit our payout? I recently got paid out on my birthday.
Oh, yeah. So, because we've got a monetized channel, it's not much money, guys, right? Like, don't get into YouTube for the money, okay? Don't just think about the channels that have millions and millions of subscribers. That you have to do it for love. You have to do it for love. If you become successful, great, but you're doing it for love, right? Yeah. And the first time we got paid by YouTube was on Charlene's birthday. So.
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is such a great, great way to celebrate. And like, keep in mind that you can only get paid out after you hit $100. Is that right?
Yeah. So that pretty much gives away how much we got.
But no, we do it for love, absolutely. That's all the time we have for today. Any questions, any comments, leave them down below. As Chris was mentioned, we have Patreon. So if you'd like to support the channel, we'll link that below as well. I think that's everything. Yeah. Otherwise, stay safe and
ciao for now.